Chapter 3 Why Should I Be Hanged? 2 weeks before the terrorists had been tried, the same military district court, with a different set of judges, had tried and condemned to death by hanging Ivan Janson, a peasant. Ivan Janson was a workman for a well-to-do farmer, in no way different from the other workmen. He was Estonian by birth, from Vendsburg, and, in the course of several years, passing from one farm to another, he had come close to the capital. He spoke Russian very poorly, and as his master was a Russian by name Lazarev, and there were no Estonians in the neighborhood, Jansen had practically remained silent for almost 2 years. In generally, he was apparently not inclined to talk, and was silent not only with human beings, but even with animals. He would water the horse in silence, harness it in silence, moving about it slowly and lazily, with short, irresolute steps, and when the horse, annoyed by his manner, would begin to frolic, to become capricious, he would beat it in silence with a heavy whip. He would beat it cruelly, with stolid, angry persistency, and when this happened at a time when he was suffering from the afternoon's after effects of a carouse, he would work himself into a frenzy. At such times the crack of the whip could be heard in the house, and the frightened, painful pounding of the horse's hoofs upon the board floor of the barn. For beating the horse his master would beat Jansen, and then, finding that he could not be reformed, paid no more attention to him. Once or twice a month Jansen became intoxicated, usually on those days when he took his master to the large railroad station, where there was a refreshment bar. After leaving his master at the station, he would drive off about half a verst away, and there, stalling the sled and the horse in the snow on the side of the road, he would wait until the train had gone. The sled would stand sideways, almost overturned, the horse standing with widely spread legs up to his belly in a snowbank, from time to time lowering his head to lick the soft, downy snow, while Jansen would recline in an awkward position in the sled as if dozing away. The unfastened ear lappets of his worn fur cap would hang down like ears of a setter, and the moist sweat would stand under his little reddish nose. Soon he would return to the station, and would quickly become intoxicated. On his way back to the farm, the whole 10 versts, he would drive at a fast gallop. The little horse, driven to madness by the whip, would rear as if possessed by a demon. The sled would sway, almost overturn, striking against poles, and Jansen, letting the reins go, would half sing, half exclaim abrupt, meaningless phrases in Estonian. But more often he would not sing, but with his teeth gritted together in an onrush of unspeakable rage, suffering, and delight, he would drive silently on as though blind. He would not notice those who passed him. He would not call to them to look out. He would not slacken his mad pace, either at the turns of the road or on the long slopes of the mountain roads. How it happened at such times that he crushed no one, how he himself was never dashed to death in one of these mad rides, was inexplicable. He would have been driven from this place as he'd been driven from other places, but he was cheap, and other workmen were not better, and thus he remained there 2 years. His life was uneventful. One day he received a letter, written in Estonian, but as he himself was illiterate, and as others did not understand Estonian, the letter remained unread, and, if not understanding that the letter might bring him tidings from his native home, he flung it into the manure with a certain savage, grim indifference. At one time Jansen tried to make love to the cook, but he was not successful, and was rudely rejected and ridiculed. He was short in stature, his face was freckled, and his small, sleepy eyes were somewhat of an indefinite color. Jansen took his failure indifferently, and never again bothered the cook. But while Jansen spoke but little, he was listening to something all the time. He heard the sounds of the dismal, snow-covered fields, with their heaps of frozen manure resembling rows of small, snow-covered graves, the sound of the blue, tender distance, of the buzzing telegraph wires, and the conversation of other people. What the fields and telegraph wires spoke to him, he alone knew, and the conversation of the people were disquieting, full of rumors about murders and robberies and arson. and one night he heard in the neighboring village the little church bell ringing faintly and helplessly, and the crackling of the flames of a fire. Some vagabonds had plundered a rich farm, had killed the master and his wife, and had set fire to the house. And on their farm, too, they lived in fear. The dogs were loose, not only at night, but also during the day, and the master slept with a gun by his side. He wished to give such a gun to Jansen, only it was an old one with one barrel. But Jansen turned the gun about in his hand, shook his head, and declined it. His master did not understand the reason, and scolded him, but the reason was that Jansen had more faith in the power of his Finnish knife than in the rusty gun. "It would kill me," he said, looking at his master sleepily with glassy eyes, and the master waved his hand in despair. "You fool! Think of having to live with such workmen!" And this same Ivan Jansen, who distrusted a gun one winter evening when the other workmen had been sent away to the station, committed a very complicated attempt at robbery, murder, and rape. He did it in a surprisingly simple manner. He locked the cook in the kitchen, lazily, with the air of a man who is longing to sleep, walked over to his master from behind, and swiftly stabbed him several times in the back with his knife. The master fell unconscious, and the mistress began to run about, screaming, while Jansen, showing his teeth and brandishing his knife, began to ransack the trunks and the chest of drawers. He found the money he sought, and then, as if noticing the mistress for the first time, and as though unexpectedly, even to himself, he rushed upon her in order to violate her. But, as he had let his knife drop to the floor, the mistress proved stronger than he, and not only did not allow him to harm her, but almost choked him into unconsciousness. Then the master on the floor turned. The cook thundered upon the door with the oven fork, breaking it open, and Jansen ran away into the fields. He was caught an hour later, kneeling down behind the corner of the barn, striking one match after another, which would not ignite, in an attempt to set the place on fire. A few days later the master died of blood poisoning, and Jansen, when his turn among other robberies and murders came, was tried and condemned to death. In court he was the same as always, a little man, freckled, with sleepy, glassy eyes. He seemed as if he did not understand in the least the meaning of what was going on about him. He appeared to be entirely indifferent. He blinked his white eyelashes stupidly, without curiosity, examined the somber, unfamiliar courtroom, and picked his nose with his hard, shriveled, unbending finger. Only those who had seen him on Sundays at church would have known that he had made an attempt to adorn himself. He wore on his neck a knitted, muddy red shawl, and in places had dampened the hair of his head. Where the hair was wet, it lay dark and smooth, while on the other side it stuck up in light and sparse tufts, like straws upon a hail-beaten, wasted meadow. When the sentence was pronounced, death by hanging, Jansen suddenly became agitated. He reddened deeply, and began to tie and untie his shawl about his neck, as though it were choking him. Then he waved his arms stupidly, and said, turning to the judge who had not read the sentence, and pointed his finger at the judge who had read it, "He said I should be hanged." "What do you mean?" asked the presiding judge, who had pronounced the sentence in a deep bass voice. Everyone smiled. Some tried to hide their smiles behind their mustaches and their paper. Jansen pointed his index finger at the presiding judge, and answered angrily, looking at him askance, "You!" "Well?" Jansen again turned his eyes to the judge, who had been silent, restraining a smile, whom he felt to be a friend, a man who had nothing to do with the sentence, and repeated, "He said that I should be hanged. Why must I be hanged? Take the prisoner away." But Jansen succeeded in repeating once more convincingly and weightily, "Why must I be hanged?" He looked so absurd, with his small, angry face, with his outstretched finger, that even the soldier of the convoy, breaking the rule, said to him in an undertone as he led him away from the courtroom, "You are a fool, young man." "Why must I be hanged?" repeated Jansen stubbornly. "They'll swing you up so quickly that you'll have no time to kick." "Keep still!" cried the other convoy angrily, but he himself could not refrain from adding, "A robber, too! Why did you take a human life, you fool? You must hang for that." "They might pardon him," said the first soldier, who began to feel sorry for Jansen. "Oh, yes, They'll pardon people like him, will they? Well, we'll talk. We've talked it through. We've talked enough." But Jansen had become silent again. When he was again placed in the cell in which he had already sat for a month, and to which he had grown accustomed, just as he had become accustomed to everything, to blows, to vodka, to the dismal snow-covered fields, with their snow heaps resembling graves, and now he even began to feel cheerful when he saw his bed, the familiar window with the grating, and when he was given something to eat. He had not eaten anything since morning. He had an unpleasant recollection of what had taken place in the court, but of that he could not think. He was unable to recall it, and death by hanging he could not picture to himself at all. Although Jansen had been condemned to death, there were many others similarly sentenced, and he was not regarded as an important criminal. They spoke to him accordingly, with neither fear nor respect, just as they would speak to prisoners who were not to be executed. The warden, on learning of the verdict, said to him, "Well, my friend, they've hanged you." "When are they going to hang me?" asked Jansen distrustfully. The warden meditated a moment. "Well, you'll have to wait until they can get together a whole party. It isn't worth bothering for one man, especially for a man like you. It is necessary to work up the right spirit." "And when will that be?" persisted Jansen. He was not at all offended that it was not worth while to hang him alone. He did not believe it, but considered it as an excuse for postponing the execution, preparatory to revoking it altogether. And he was seized with joy. The confused, terrible moment of which it was so painful to think retreated far into the distance, becoming fictitious and improbable, as death always seems. "When? When?" cried the warden, a dull, morose old man, growing angry. "It isn't like hanging a dog, which you take behind the barn. It is to be done, and it is to be done in no time. I suppose you would like to be hanged like that, you fool." "I don't want to be hanged." And suddenly Jansen frowned strangely. "He said that I should be hanged, but I don't want it." And perhaps for the first time in his life he laughed, a hoarse, absurd, yet gay and joyous laugh. It sounded like the cackling of a goose. "Ga, ga, ga." The warden looked at him in astonishment, then knit his brow sternly. This strange gaiety of a man who was to be executed was an offence to the prison, as well to the very executioner. It made them appear absurd. And suddenly, for the briefest instant, it appeared to the old warden, who had passed all his life in the prison, and who looked upon its laws as laws of nature, that the prison and all the life within it was something like an insane asylum, in which he, the warden, was the chief lunatic. "Pshaw! The devil take you!" And he spat aside. "What are you giggling here? This is no dram shop." "And I don't want to be hanged," laughed Jansen. "Satan!" muttered the inspector, feeling the need of making the sign of the cross. This little man, with his small, wizened face, he resembled least of all the devil, but there was that in his silly giggling which destroyed the sanctity and the strength of the prison. If he laughed longer, it seemed to the warden as if the walls might fall asunder, the grating melt and drop out, as if the warden himself might lead the prisoners to the gates, bowing and saying, "Take a walk in the city, gentlemen, or perhaps some of you would like to go to the village." "Satan!" But Jansen had stopped laughing, and was now winking cunningly. "You'd better look out," said the warden, with an indefinite threat, and he walked away, glancing back of him. Jansen was calm and cheerful throughout the evening. He repeated to himself, "I shall not be hanged," and it seemed to him so convincing, so wise, so irrefutable, that it was unnecessary to feel unease. He had long forgotten about his crime. Only sometimes he regretted that he had not been successful in attacking his master's wife. But he soon forgot that, too.